I don't know how I missed this. So, literally less than a month after I released my last video about Beyond Good and Evil 2, Michel Ancel left Ubisoft, the company he had worked for since he was a teenager back in the late 1980s, to go off and pet foxes in the woods or something. Both Ancel and Ubisoft tried to spin this as a deliberate decision on Ancel's part, and for all I know it was. But regardless of that, it's a terrible omen for Beyond Good and Evil 2's development. We're talking about the departure of the only guy at Ubisoft who even wanted there to be a Beyond Good and Evil 2. One of the few people there who's known for making anything other than open-world sandboxes and online shooters. Michel Ancel was one of the few remaining links to Ubisoft's past, and probably the only one trying to keep that past alive. With him out of the picture, it's obvious that there will no longer be any internal pressure to get this project finished, or to make sure it's anything like the original. I'd be willing to bet most of the people currently working on this have never even played the original Beyond Good and Evil. It came out 17 years ago. Even the people who played it when it came out have fuzzy memories of what it was really like, let alone a general gaming audience that includes lots of people who weren't even alive back then. But the worst thing about all this is that I'm starting to see a pattern emerge in the circumstances behind this game's development. A pattern that eerily resembles the fiasco that was Duke Nukem Forever. In the main video, I was at pains to describe how Beyond Good and Evil 2 was different from that legendary piece of vaporware that eventually graduated to the status of shovelware. But the removal of the game's leading creative force from authority over the project he started has tipped the balance in the other direction. I would argue that these two game projects now have considerably more in common than they have differences. All this made me very anxious to find out more about what is going on behind the scenes at Ubisoft. And while I naturally don't have any privileged information about the development of Beyond Good and Evil 2, there is one public document that showed me more than anything else could have how truly, madly, deeply screwed up this project really is. It's the official statement Ubisoft released immediately after Michel Ancel left the company. Let's read it together and see what gems of knowledge are there to be discovered. Hello, BG&E fans and space monkeys. Okay, stop right there. What in the flying monkey is a space monkey? Well, it turns out that this is a name Ubisoft uses for people who contributed to a crowdsourcing project for art and music, and also more generally for people who use the official Beyond Good and Evil 2 forum. I didn't even realize this game had a forum, so naturally, as soon as I heard about it, I had to check it out. Okay, so it isn't at the top of the Ubisoft forums. I guess that makes sense. Nope, not yet. Okay, here it is. Right between the forum for the South Park mobile collectible card game and the one for the studio that makes the South Park mobile collectible card game. Not exactly distinguished company, but maybe it gets better once we actually get to the forum. Well, here's a thread about the game's setting, which contains lots of things I didn't know about until just now. Like that Beyond Good and Evil 2 is a prequel, because that makes sense. And that the plot is about India and China making human-animal hybrids for interstellar colonization. Obvious, right? I mean, that's clearly the direction the original game was going in near the end. And apparently it's an always-online multiplayer open-world game where you create your own character and travel between planets that have randomly generated minor characters on them. Huh. So, not only does this sound like generic sandbox garbage, it also sounds absolutely nothing like Beyond Good and Evil. What it does sound like is some unholy combination of No Man's Sky, Sonic Forces, and Destiny 2. I hope you'll recall that one of the biggest stumbling blocks to Duke Nukem Forever's development was George Broussard's inability to focus on a few core gameplay elements because he wanted to make the game everything to everybody. With that in mind, let's take a look at the core gameplay elements of Beyond Good and Evil 2. The game will have melee and gun combat, exploration, stealth, resource management, quests with multiple solutions, procedurally generated planets, a jetpack, minigames, customizable spaceship bases, racing, space dogfights, a police system, and a camera like in the first game, except now it can scan enemies and tell you their weaknesses and probably lots of other stuff. This is not Focus. This is kid in a candy store level thinking. And don't forget, this is the state they were in before Michel Ancel left. He contributed to this, and now he's not around to try to cut it back to a more reasonable set of goals. Can anybody guess which of these things aren't going to make it to the finished product? Because I'd be willing to bet they won't cut any of the stuff that makes this game more like every other goddamn game Ubisoft's made in the last decade, when they could just cut everything that makes this game even remotely like the game that supposedly inspired it. Especially when you consider that Ubisoft's generic open-world sandboxes all make boatloads of money, and Beyond Good and Evil sank like a rock. So now that we know just what we were dealing with here before September of 2020, let's get back to that statement. As he said via Instagram today, Michel Ancel has decided to stop working in video games in order to focus on other personal projects, and will no longer be part of the BG&E 2 team. His uncompromising passion pushed us to redefine what was possible in crafting an expansive, multicultural, and futuristic science fiction world. As we move forward, we are all committed to remaining true to this vision. Ubisoft, with the best will in the world, bullshit. It's certainly true that Michel Ancel redefined what Beyond Good and Evil could be, and then redefined it again, and again, without ever getting close to a coherent vision for the game. George Broussard did exactly the same thing with Duke Nukem Forever, and that ruined it. As for Ancel being uncompromising, that's laughable. Ancel compromised a lot just to get this game's development on the table. He wanted it to be a single-player experience. Ubisoft made it a multiplayer co-op game. He wanted characters from the original to appear. Ubisoft turned the game into a prequel. He wanted major characters with depth and personality. Ubisoft decided to have a self-insert create-your-own protagonist. Let's be honest, Ubisoft. If Ancel hadn't made some serious compromises, we wouldn't even be talking about Beyond Good and Evil 2 right now. We'd be talking about why Beyond Good and Evil never had a sequel, which is still something we might be talking about in a few years. As Michel noted, he hasn't been directly involved for some time now, as the team has been hard at work building on top of the solid foundation he helped shape. This just reeks of whitewash. Michel Ancel isn't brought in to make a solid foundation for games. He's brought in to design them, and also to write them, to the extent that they need that. And I'm thinking that the big problem here is that this is precisely what he tried to do, and Ubisoft kept trying to convince him that this isn't the kind of game that needs a story focus or strong characters. What it seems like they actually want to say is, Michel did everything we wanted him to, but then he wanted to micromanage the project. We told him to cool it, and he didn't get the message. Michel, you're finished. We can take it from here. Go do something else. We recently passed an important internal milestone, building upon the promise of our tech demos shown at E3. Well, I'll give them one thing. They did get to the tech demo stage. Duke Nukem Forever didn't get that far until 2011, the same year it finally released, to the disappointment of gamers everywhere. The thing is, though, these are tech demos. They show off how the game functions, not what it actually is. There's no real story in the demos, no character development, no set pieces. What it tells us, essentially, is that they have an engine and some art assets. It doesn't give us a single clue as to how far along they are in designing the game. I also note that while they claim to have passed an important internal milestone, they give absolutely no clues as to what this so-called milestone is. Without any information on it, we have to take it on faith that what they're talking about is actually important enough to even be called a milestone. Remember how I said in the main video that the best way to avoid making vaporware is to be honest and upfront with your customers about how things are going? Yeah, this is not how you do that, Ubisoft. This is cagey, this is vague, and frankly, it's suspicious. We still have a lot more to do, and we're ramping up the size of the team to help. Yes, I'm sure that when you're dealing with a project whose biggest problems are feature creep and an absence of stable leadership, just adding more artists and programmers will totally help with that. I realize I'm just a YouTube scrub, but Ubisoft, I'm going to go out on a limb here and give you some advice. The last thing you need is more low-level grunts to crank out more art assets and music and characters and planets for a game that is already groaning with the weight of too many ideas. What you need is for someone to take charge of this project and stake their career in it being a success. Someone who's already been working on this for years and knows what the team you already have can and cannot do. I would suggest the guy who's writing this official statement. He's clearly a high-ranking member of the team, and if this letter is to be believed, he sincerely cares about the project. Tell him it's in his hands, that he doesn't have to make the game anything beyond a simple multiplayer shooter with a decent story, that this doesn't have to be the most amazing game ever created, since it's not going to be that anyway, and also tell him that if he doesn't get the game out in a year, he'll be transferred to Ubisoft Siberia to work on Hungry Dragon 2. Next milestone. We are aiming to share more and show you the game in action sometime next year, once we pass our next internal production milestones. So the first thing they need to do to get to the next milestone is pass several other milestones which they refuse to explain. Great. And also they want to show us the game in action, which is something they've already done. That's what a tech demo is. If what they mean by this is that they've restarted development again, and they have to get back to the demo stage again, I swear by all that is holy, I will start making fun of Yves Guillemot's hair myself. I'll do it, Ubisoft. Don't tempt me. We know many of you are eager to hear from the team, get more detail on the story and the universe. Some detail, Ubisoft. We want some detail on the story. Learning that China started making pig people in 2400 and having them dig up space rocks on the moon is not a story, it's a setting detail. I think what fans of the original want more than anything else is to know who the main character is, where they come from, and what happens to them, in a broad sense, over the course of the story. Now, that might be difficult if the main character is player-generated, but I have two responses to that. One, it is still possible to write a story for a create-your-own character, and two, how about just not even doing that in the first place? Because why? What's the actual point? Assassin's Creed doesn't have a player-generated character. Far Cry doesn't have a player-generated character. Why should this? Do you even know why you're doing what you're doing, Ubisoft? We're equally excited to share all of that with you, but we will take the time needed to get it right. We want to go beyond the high expectations you have of us, and that we have for ourselves. High expectations. The road to development hell is paved with high expectations. George Broussard didn't ruin Duke Nukem Forever by setting his sights too low. He did it by burning out everyone who was interested in what he was working on. He was a perfectionist, and assuming that Guillaume Brunier is telling the truth, so is everyone working on Beyond Good and Evil 2. And the thing about perfectionists is that they don't put out perfect work, because no one does. Perfectionists get paralyzed with indecision and put out nothing at all. Which is exactly what we've gotten from Ubisoft after years and years of waiting. Thank you for your patience. Sure thing, Ubisoft. Thank you for yanking my chain for over a decade and firing the only creative person on your payroll. And remember, we're always happy to have your feedback. That's good to hear. Here's my feedback, Ubisoft. You are failing, you are lying, and one of your most anticipated gaming projects is well on its way to being the biggest embarrassment to have your name on it since you published Charlie's Angels in 2003. You know, when I look back on everything that's happened since that overhyped trailer came out in 2017, what sticks with me more than anything else is that everyone wanted something different out of Beyond Good and Evil 2, and nobody's hopes and dreams were compatible with anybody else's. Fans of the original were hoping that Beyond Good and Evil 2 would be like a tribute to the original, with the same spirit and all the same unique touches that made it such a breath of fresh air back in the early 2000s. We wanted a proper sequel that carried on the original story, resolved its cliffhangers, and reunited us with beloved characters in a new setting. But in Michel Ancel's mind, Beyond Good and Evil 2 was going to be a grand experiment, a way for him to tell an epic sci-fi story that would totally eclipse the original game, both mechanically and visually. He didn't want to make a sequel, he wanted to make a spiritual successor, like what BioShock was to System Shock 2. And given how much time had passed when he started working on it, that honestly would have made more sense than a direct sequel, however much fans wanted it. And of course, Michel Ancel's bosses didn't want what we wanted or what he wanted. What the higher-ups were hoping for was something like, well, like the South Park mobile collectible card game, a project that would use Beyond Good and Evil's immense critical profile to sell the die-hard fans on a more trendy, lucrative mainstream experience. Ubisoft is possibly the most risk-averse of all the major publishers. Most of their popular games are very similar, and these days they don't branch out into untested genres or design concepts without a damn good reason. 15 years ago, Ubisoft wanted their own version of World of Warcraft so they could make $1 billion. 5 years ago, they wanted their own version of Pokemon Go so they could make $1 billion. Now they want their own version of Destiny 2 so they can make $1 billion. That game released just a few months after the Beyond Good and Evil 2 trailer appeared at E3. And what a coincidence, a few months after Destiny 2 releases, suddenly Ubisoft's talking about their interest in making an online multiplayer RPG with guns and space travel. And that's where we are now. Ubisoft is soft-pedaling the development of Beyond Good and Evil 2, fans are becoming increasingly anxious and despondent about this series' future, and Michel Ancel is in rural France somewhere giving back massages to injured bunny rabbits. At this point, the only thing we can do is hope that the team will get its act together and actually make the game they've been pretending to make since 2008. And at the same time, we have to hope that what ends up with the name Beyond Good and Evil 2 slapped on it isn't some soulless, trend-hopping mediocrity that sullies the memory of what was once a beloved and critically acclaimed adventure game. But I wouldn't hope too hard if I were you.